Okay. All right, we're good to go. So, the title of this week's class is Lowering the Heavens. Actually, lowering might not be quite the right terminology. The idea is really to bring the heavens downwards. In other words, to draw them down. To bring the heavens down is not a good terminology either. But I guess lowering the heavens is what's going to do it. What I mean by this, we'll soon find out. Basically, there are two divine forces. They're called in Kabbalistic terminology, these are called two types of light. There's the all-encompassing light, which is in Hebrew called Sovev Kol Almin, the all-encompassing transcendent light. It's all-encompassing because it's not found in any particular vessel, and it's not able to be contained because it is too great to be contained. That's called the transcendent light, or the Or HaSovev Kol Almin, literally the light which surrounds all of the worlds, all of the planes of reality. Worlds are planes of reality, as we know. And then there is the Or HaMamale Kol Almin. There's the immanent light, the light which is measured out according to the various planes of existence, according to the various worlds, and in the worlds themselves, according to the various vessels which contain these lights, which these vessels are called the Sfirot, as we all know. Let me just put up on the screen a picture of what we're talking about here. Let's see, share screen. Here we go. Okay, as we all know, the Sfirot don't necessarily look exactly like this, but this is a decent representation of what the Sfirot are. This would be the vessel of the Sfirah, right? And then the light inside is given the name the Or of Chokhmah, etc., the Or of Da'at, the Or of Binah, the Or of Chesed, Gvura, Tiferet, etc., etc. What is the transcendent light? The transcendent light is really the light that, there's two ways of explaining it. Either the light that is in Keter itself, which is a transcendent light, or the light that even transcends Keter and envelops all of the worlds equally. That's called Sovev Kol Almin. Both of them are true. Both of those explanations are actually good because there's really two aspects to Sovev. There's Sovev Prati and Sovev Klali. There's Sovev, which is Sovev, that particular world, which is associated with Keter of that world. And the Sovev Klali, the general Sovev, which envelops and surrounds all of the worlds equally. Okay, so when we say lowering the heavens, what we mean is bringing this transcendent, enveloping light down into reality, into this world. Now, as we all know, the way of bringing down the immanent light, not the surrounding light, not the enveloping light, but the immanent light, is by way of intellectually, in terms of Torah studying wisdom, studying the wisdom of the sages, studying the wisdom of the Torah, studying the wisdom of Kabbalah, that brings down into intellectual grasp, of course, each according to his capabilities, each according to his or her capabilities. And that would be the idea of the chokhmah, the wisdom and understanding of Torah, as well as the various emotional qualities that are required by a Torah lifestyle, by living one's life according to the Torah. But that is also immanent light that is brought into emotional, something that we can feel. And then, of course, there's those aspects of the Torah that are actually what things that we do. So there's intellect, there's emotion, and there's action. And all of those are different aspects of this immanent light. How do we bring that down? Again, through Torah study and through fulfilling the commandments, essentially. that brings down the immanent light, and to a certain extent, the mitzvot, the commandments, are to a certain extent have a transcendent aspect to them. But the question is, how do we draw down the ultimately transcendent aspect, the light that surrounds all of the worlds? So, one of the ways in which this is done is through what is called self-sacrifice, mesirut nefesh, as it's called, self-sacrifice. Sacrificing oneself, in other words, the willingness to give up one's life or and one's being, one's existence in this world for the sake of a transcendent principle, already elicits that transcendent principle. Without having to become a martyr necessarily, there's other ways of bringing this down, and one of them is through the power of the transcendent, one of the transcendent powers of the soul, the power which is called emunah, faith. Actually, emunah doesn't have a good translation in English. Faith is not exactly the right translation. It's more the concept of faithfulness than it is faith. But nevertheless, emunah is one of these ideas. How do we achieve emunah? This is, in other words, this concept of transcendent faith. Well, what we're talking about here is something non-rational, not irrational necessarily, but non-rational behavior. Through rational behavior, we can elicit the lights of the immanent aspects of the light can be elicited through rational behavior, or through doing those commandments, fulfilling those commandments which have reason. How do we elicit a non-rational behavior? What is non-rational behavior? Well, one of these ideas is self-sacrifice, and another one is belief. That is non-rational behavior, not irrational necessarily, but it's non-rational in the sense that it transcends intellect. Now, this week's Torah reading is the section called Chukat, or Chukas. And this deals with the ashes of the red heifer. What's a red heifer? The red heifer is a red cow, essentially, where all of the hairs of the cow have to all be red. Even two hairs that are black or any other color actually invalidate the whole thing. And there have only been 9 of these in history. What is it used for? The ashes of the red heifer is slaughtered, put on and burnt to a crisp. The ashes are then administered together with water from a living spring to purify what was essentially impure. If a person came into contact with the dead, for example, which is the most serious level of spiritual impurity, which one has to sometimes come into contact with such spiritual impurity. But the spiritual impurity, contact with the dead, and defilement by contact with the dead is purified by administering the ashes of the red heifer. Now, the whole concept of the ashes of the red heifer is what's called in the Torah a chok. In other words, a non-rational law. It's a non-rational law. There's no explanation for it. Why we do it, no explanation has been given in the Torah, and there's not even any explanation given in the Kabbalah. There's no explanation for it. No explanation for this mitzvah, for this commandment. Now, through fulfilling this commandment and the equivalent of it, which we'll understand in a minute, through fulfilling it, because we don't do it in our days, it's only at the time that we have the temple that you have the ashes of the red heifer, and we don't have the temple now, so we don't have the temple in Jerusalem. In other words, the Beit HaMikdash, the great temple that was in Jerusalem, was destroyed by the Romans, and in about 70, I think, of the first century, somewhere in the 70th year of the first century of the Common Era. So, by Titus. Titus was the Roman general at the time. In any event, this whole concept of the para aduma, of this red heifer, represents this concept of non-rational behavior, of doing things in a transcendent way, in a thing that transcends logic, perhaps even defies logic to a certain extent. But it's not irrational. It simply doesn't have any rational. There's no. It doesn't fit in our heads at all. It's something transcendent. This is the will of God, and that's all there is to it, essentially. Now, what is the purpose of the red heifer, the ashes of the red heifer? To purify those who have become impure with the dead. Why a red heifer in particular? Well, there are some explanations of that brought in the Zohar and various other places, that the Israelites prior to this had worshipped the golden calf. Therefore, along came this cow, this golden calf, this red cow, to atone for the sin of the golden calf. But there's a very interesting story regarding the one of the red heifers that was prepared in the time of the Second Temple. There was a person who lived in Israel in a place called Ashkelon. Ashkelon was not really a Jewish city at that time. Today it is. But Ashkelon was not a Jewish city, and although there were Jews that lived there as well, there were many non-Jewish people that lived there. And one of these people that lived there was someone whose name was Dama Ben Netina. Dama Ben Netina. So this Dama Ben Netina was known to be a very honest and upright person, and he also happened to be very wealthy. Now, it so happened that one time the Urim Vatumim is a breastplate of the high priest that has on it 12 stones corresponding to the 12 tribes. And one of the stones had gotten destroyed or lost. It was called an Even Shoham, right? One of the stones was lost. And the sages made various inquiries as to where they could get another one. And they were told that this man, Dama Ben Netina, had such a stone. So they traveled to Ashkelon at the first possible opportunity. They traveled to Ashkelon and they went to talk to Dama Ben Netina to ask him for his. They wanted to buy the stone from him. He said, "Yes, I have such a stone, but I can't give it to you now." So they'd offered him a price already, and it was what the stone was worth. But he said, "No, I can't accept money from you right now." So they started raising the price and raising the price and raising the price, and he still refused. And the reason that he refused was not because he didn't want to sell the stone, but because the stone was, well, there's the various versions of it, but according to one version of the story, the stone was in a box, and his father, Dama Ben Netina's father, Netina in other words, was asleep, and he had his head on that box. According to other versions of the story, he had his feet on the box. So according to a third version of the story, he had the key to the box under his pillow, and he was asleep. And Dama Ben Netina refused to wake his father up in order to get the key, or in order to get the stone to give to the sages. He was willing to sell it to them, but he couldn't sell it to them because his father was asleep. Now, this act of tremendous respect for his father, he just didn't want to wake him up, even though it meant he would lose a huge amount of money, because they offered him a very, very nice sum of money for the stone, especially when they kept on adding on to the price, thinking that he was just stalling for a greater price. But he refused, and the reason was because his father was sleeping. He didn't want to wake him up. He didn't want to wake up his father. Tremendous respect for his father. And not only for his father, but he had tremendous respect for his mother as well. The Talmud also tells another story about him, that he was one of the honored citizens who sat in the what is it called, like the parliamentary meetings when the Roman governor had sort of his board of governors running things, and he was one of the governors of that province, or a high official or whatever. He was a very high official, being that he was a very wealthy man, so he wore a like a toga or whatever, Roman dress, I guess, but made of he wore this toga which was made of gold thread. It was made from gold. He was a very wealthy man, made from golden thread. When he was in the middle of a meeting, the Talmud tells, his mother, who was a bit cuckoo, burst into the meeting, and she started yelling at him, and in fact even hit him and ripped his clothes, and he didn't respond. He just held back, and he didn't say anything to her. He didn't embarrass her, he didn't yell at her, didn't shout, didn't throw her out. He didn't tell the guards to come and take her away until she herself went away, and then he just continued the meeting as if nothing had happened. So this was a man that had unbelievable respect for his parents, even though they didn't show him, at least his mother didn't show him a similar level of respect. Nevertheless, he had tremendous respect for them. And so the sages didn't quite realize, they thought that he must be, either he didn't have such a stone, or that he was, asking for too high a price. So they decided they were going to leave and find another stone somewhere else. Anyway, they left, and shortly afterwards, Dama Ben Netina sends his servant to call him back, says, my father woke up. Dama Ben Netina's father woke up, and he's now able to give you the stone. So they came to get the stone, and they took out the amount of money that was their last offer. And he said, no, I'm not going to take this much money. You had offered me the first offer I was willing to accept, and therefore that's all I'm going to take from you. Since I was willing to accept it, that's all I'm going to take. I'm not going to take the extra that you would have given me had I held out and bargained with you. He has the stone, he took the money, and sometime later on, he was rewarded when they needed a new red heifer, and he happened to have in his flock of cattle, his herd of cattle, he happened to have a red heifer that the sages then came and bought from him, and it made up all of the extra money that he had lost before by not wanting to take the higher price. He made up by selling them this red heifer. In fact, I remember very many years ago when I was first starting out in my career, my teaching career, I happened to be in a very posh, I taught in a very posh school called Carmel College, which was outside London on the Thames River. Beautiful sort of historic school, Jewish boarding school, the only one in all of Europe. And they got one of the professors of Oxford. This was the college that I was in, was just not very far from Oxford. So one of the professors came and he told a very similar story that had actually happened, that he heard about. He's a professor of business. He came to give the end of year speech, what's it called, the commencement speech, I think, yeah. He came to give the commencement speech, and he told us sort of a similar story about a Jewish man who dealt in precious metals, not precious metals, rare metals. I'm sorry, rare metals, like molybdenum and like all these other kinds of rare metals that are used in things like iPhones and so on and so forth. Today they use it for those kinds of things. Very rare metals and things that that no stores have. I mean, these are dealt, special merchants deal with them. Anyway, he was a person that had these some of these special metals. This was in the days of the fax machine. So he was at home, and it was the Sabbath. It was a Sabbath day. He hears the fax machine going in the middle of his Sabbath meal, and this is very strange because usually people don't send him faxes on Sabbath. They know not to send him faxes, but he leaves it on anyway because that's okay. You can do that. So he left his fax machine on, and sometime later, another 20 minutes later, another fax came in, and then sometime later another fax came in, and another fax came in, another fax came in, and so on. And several faxes came in. He didn't go and see what was going on, but after the Sabbath was over, he went into his study and he saw that all the faxes were from the same place. There was a company that urgently needed a certain metal, and he, in his warehouses, had that metal, and it was the only one in England or wherever it was that had this kind of that had access to this metal. And they offered him the market price for a pound, an ounce, whatever it was, and he didn't respond. Why? Because it was the Sabbath, an Orthodox Jew, right? He didn't want to violate the Sabbath. They thought he didn't answer because they weren't offering enough, so they kept on upping their offering. Until they raised it to like 3 times the normal price, but they needed it so desperately that they felt like they had to. So he called them after the Sabbath and he said, yes, I have the metal, and the reason that I didn't respond earlier was because of the Sabbath. I am Sabbath observant, and I will accept your first offer because that's what I would have accepted anyway, the going market price. They said, are you sure? I mean, we offered you 3 times as much. He said, no, I'm going to accept the first offer. Because that's the fair offer, and I didn't want to do them out of their hard-earned money by charging more than he should have. In any event, so we see a similar kind of a situation now. The story of Dama Ben Netina, as we said before, the respect that he showed for his father. Now, respect for one's parent is a concept that we can understand. It's a rational commandment in the Torah. It's one of the 10 commandments to honor your father and mother. But it's a rational thing. We understand why it's so necessary. We understand why it's necessary for society. Because if society would not observe the proper honoring of parents, things would fall apart, as we can see happening to some extent today. Hopefully things will improve, but in any event. So, why then there's a famous writer, Hasidic Rebbe. He's a Hasidic Grand Master, if you want to call him that, a Rebbe, called the Chidusha Harim, after the name of his book. So he asks, why is it that Dama Ben Netina was rewarded through the red heifer? Because again, the story was that he gave them the stone that they wanted at the original price, and later on, a red heifer was born into his flocks that he then sold to the sages for their needs in the temple. They're very rare creatures, these red heifers. He later sold them for all the money that he would have made otherwise. So the Chidusha Harim asks the question: why is it that it was precisely this para aduma, this red heifer, that sort of almost miraculously was born into his flocks, into his herd of cattle? And the answer he gives is because there's a hint over here. The hint is that when we do something for rational reasons, like the concept of honoring and respecting one's parents, which is a rational thing, we can understand it rationally. So that is a very great thing. No one's going to poo-poo it or sneeze at it and say that it's it doesn't mean much. It means a huge amount. But don't think that that's all that there is to it. There are certain things that are transcendent. There are mitzvahs that are transcendent. In other words, the mitzvah of the red heifer, the kind of commandment of administering the ashes of the red heifer together with spring water to purify the impurity of the dead, or they come into contact with the impurity of the dead, which is a trans-rational or a super-rational, let's call it, commandment. In other words, there was a hint over here. A hint for us, not necessarily for Dama Ben Netina. It was a hint for us. Don't think that doing a commandment in a way of, because it's dictated by logic, which Dama Ben Netina, again, was not a Jewish person, so he was not subject to the laws of the Torah per se. Yes, it's true that all the nations in the world have the obligation of honoring one's parents, but the degree to which one needs to honor the parents is not to that extent that he wouldn't have woken up his father. So the Torah comes along to tell us, or this incident comes along to tell us, the Talmud tells us that the reason that he was rewarded with this red heifer is because there's something else going on over here. There's a greater thing going on. And that greater thing is to remind us that there are things that we must do, not because we understand them, but despite the fact that we don't understand them. We have to do those things. And that is what ultimately elicits this transcendent light. Doing things not because they have rational, because there's some kind of rational reason for them that we can understand, but to do things because they're right. It's the right thing to do. It's the proper thing to do. It's the transcendent thing to do. And that's why it's hinted to in this particular incident. And that, in fact, is what purifies a person from contact with the dead. What's the idea of what's the idea of death? The idea of death as an end to life. It's the most unholy thing that can happen is death. Why? Because divinity, godliness is life. The Torah is called life as well. Eitz Chaim, it's the tree of life. God is called Makor Mayim Chaim, the origin of the waters of life. And the soul is also called life. One of the levels of the soul, in fact, is called Chaya. Chaya means alive. It's aliveness. So death is the complete opposite of that. And so too is idolatry. Idolatry means that what is idolatry usually? Idolatry means that you worship, a person worships the forces of nature, essentially. That's most idolatry has to do. The sun, the moon, the stars, natural forces, and so on. These are the things that are worshipped. So by worshiping the limited, the finite forces of nature, one loses contact with the infinite, with the eternal. Since nature is often changing, not often, it's always changing with the seasons, changing day by day, changing hour by hour, whereas contact with the divine is eternal. Ani Hashem lo shaniti, I'm God who does not change. There's no change that affects God. Therefore, worshipping natural forces, and that's why they worship this golden calf, which represented the force, the power of the ox. It represented the concept of power, the concept of gevura. In our diagram in the Sfirot, gevura is this Sfira over here and represents the concept of might, right? Strength and might. Okay, so that idea is essentially what they were worshiping. They were worshiping this idea of power. They were worshiping power. Now, it's not unusual for people even today to worship power. Look at all the people in Washington. All of them over there, mostly, I shouldn't say all, but the vast majority are power-hungry people. They worship power. It's basically what they're all about. Power and perhaps wealth as well, but nevertheless. Without getting into any politics over here. So, The idea, therefore, is that it's limited, just like the intellect is limited. Worshipping what one can understand only, in other words, worshipping things that make sense to us, is worship, but it's limited. Along comes the commandment of the para aduma, of this red heifer, which transcends intellect. It doesn't make any rational sense. It's super rational. And therefore, that brings out a whole different dimension of divine energy, the transcendent realm, the transcendent dimension. And that is really what this week's Torah reading is all about, the transcendent dimension and bringing it down, which I've called lowering the heavens. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, that is it for right now. If there are any questions, I'll be happy to answer them.